Close your eyes for just a moment and think about the world you live in today. The phone in your hand, the electric car gliding silently down the street, the morning coffee you sip, or the sweet chocolate bar you might enjoy after dinner. All of these things have something in common. They are built on Africa's raw materials: gold, cocoa, coffee, lithium, uranium, timber, the hidden foundation of modern life. For generations, the West grew rich, believing Africa would remain a quiet warehouse, always open, always cheap. But what if that assumption has just collapsed? What if, for the first time in living memory, Africa is no longer giving away its treasures, but holding them back, processing them at home, and demanding respect on the global stage? That is exactly what is happening now. From Ghana to Uganda, from Niger to Namibia, more than 10 African nations have taken bold steps to ban or restrict raw exports. They are saying, no more cheap giveaways, no more silent exploitation. If you want our resources, you deal on our terms. And the shockwaves are already rattling Western capitals from Paris to Washington because the world's supply chains were never built to handle an Africa that says no. This moment is bigger than economics. It's about sovereignty. It's about dignity. It's about a continent that has been underestimated for too long, suddenly standing tall and speaking with one voice. So here is the question for you: is this the dawn of a new economic order, one where Africa finally holds the leverage the world never expected? And if so, how will the West respond? If you believe these are the stories that matter, the truths that are bigger than the headlines, then stay with us. Please share if you feel you are one of the first to recognize and support President Ibrahim Traoré and Africa's rise. And subscribe if you believe that the future belongs to those who refuse to bow down. For decades, Africa's role in the world economy was written in one sentence: exporter of raw materials. Gold shipped unrefined, cocoa beans bagged and sent off, coffee in its simplest form, timber cut as logs, minerals dug straight from the ground and placed onto ships bound for Europe, America, or Asia. The pattern was clear. Africa provided the bones of modern civilization, but the flesh and profit were added elsewhere. That script is now being torn apart. In the past few years, more than 10 African nations have stepped forward to rewrite the rules. They are not content to be mere suppliers anymore. They are placing restrictions on raw exports, demanding local processing, and insisting that value be kept at home. This is not just economic policy, it is a declaration of sovereignty. Take Ghana, one of the continent's top gold producers. For years, multinational companies bought gold, cheaply shipped it abroad, and made their profits refining it elsewhere. Ghanaians saw little benefit beyond wages for miners and minimal tax revenue. But in a decisive break, Ghana's government now requires mining companies to sell 20% of refined gold directly to the central bank. The aim is clear: strengthen national reserves and reduce dependence on foreign currencies like the dollar and the euro. Alongside this, part of the refining process is being forced back into Ghana itself, creating jobs and raising skills in industries that had long been absent. What once looked like a colony's role in the gold trade is shifting into the role of a strategist. Move to Uganda, where coffee tells a similar story. In 2021, the government banned exports of raw beans. At first, it sounded like an impossible gamble. Uganda is among the world's top coffee producers, and Western corporations had built entire business models on buying cheap beans, roasting them abroad, and selling coffee at premium prices. But the Ugandan government stood firm. The message was simple: why should our farmers stay poor while others grow rich from their labor? By shifting to roasted and packaged coffee for export, Uganda is keeping more value within its borders. It is not just about money, it is about fairness, dignity, and finally seeing farmers rewarded for the sweat they pour into the fields. In Gabon, the story began earlier in 2010 with a ban on raw log exports. For decades, European companies harvested Gabon's forests, turning them into luxury furniture and flooring abroad, while Gabon itself gained little. Leaders in Libreville asked the crucial question: if our timber can build European wealth, why shouldn't it build our own? The answer was bold action. No more raw logs leaving the country. Local carpentry and furniture industries flourished. Jobs multiplied, the economy diversified. What looked like a technical trade policy became a symbol of empowerment. The ripple continued. In Mozambique, the same policy followed: no raw logs, only processed wood. Factories emerged, jobs grew, and profits that once vanished overseas began to circulate locally. Meanwhile, Guinea took an even more personal step, one tied to survival itself. In a nation where food insecurity cut deep, leaders banned exports of rice, maize, and yams. For decades, Guinean harvests were shipped abroad, while families at home paid exorbitant prices for staples. The contradiction was unbearable. By halting exports, the government declared that no foreign buyer comes before the mouths of its citizens. It was a moment of food sovereignty, ensuring that children in Conakry would eat before rice ships left port. And then came Zimbabwe, long one of the world's major chrome suppliers. For years, raw chrome was shipped cheaply to fuel stainless steel industries abroad. The new ban on raw chrome exports changed everything. Smelters and metal processing plants began rising in Zimbabwe itself. Instead of sending away raw wealth, the country now insists on adding value at home, creating industries that can sustain future generations. Each of these moves on its own could have been dismissed as policy tinkering. But together they represent a continental wave. From gold in Ghana to coffee in Uganda, from timber in Gabon and Mozambique to food in Guinea, from chrome in Zimbabwe to minerals across the map, Africa is no longer whispering. It is speaking loudly with action that it will no longer be the silent backbone of global industry. What we are witnessing is the early stage of a revolution in trade. For centuries, profits piled up abroad while African nations remained dependent and vulnerable. Now the tide is turning. The question is no longer whether Africa can change the rules it already has. The question is how far this wave will spread and how the rest of the world will respond. Picture this Paris at night, the city of lights glowing as always. Behind the beauty, however, lies a fragile truth. Nearly 70% of France's electricity, its entire nuclear grid, depends on uranium mined thousands of miles away in Niger. For decades, that uranium flowed out at bargain prices, enriching Europe, while Niger sat at the bottom of the poverty ladder. Then came the turning point. Niger's leaders announced restrictions on uranium exports. No more giveaways, no more silent extraction. It was a political thunderclap. And suddenly the lights in Europe flickered, not literally, but in the halls of government, in the trading floors of energy markets, and in the whispers of diplomats. The comfortable illusion of energy independence shattered in a single stroke. This was not just a trade policy. It was a direct challenge to the global order. For years, France operated as if Niger's resources were permanently guaranteed. That assumption evaporated overnight. Uranium prices climbed. Energy companies scrambled. The French government faced questions it wasn't prepared to answer. What happens if Niger closes the tap even further? What if other African nations follow suit? And here lies the true climax. For the first time in modern history, a small African nation had pressed a button, and the ripple effects shook the very core of a European superpower. But Niger was not alone. Around the continent, similar moves ignited reactions. In Ghana, the requirement that 20% of refined gold be sold directly to the central bank sparked outrage among Western mining companies. For years, they had reaped easy profits by buying unrefined gold cheap and processing it abroad. Now they faced tighter margins and a Ghanaian government refusing to play by old rules. Stock prices dipped, investors fretted, and the message was loud: Ghana is no longer a passive supplier. In Uganda, the ban on exporting raw coffee beans sent shockwaves through global coffee giants. For generations, Western corporations thrived by paying pennies for raw beans, then selling roasted packaged coffee for dollars. Overnight, their model was disrupted. They now had to either pay more for finished Ugandan coffee or build processing plants in Kampala. Either way, the ground shifted. Western media struggled to frame these changes. Headlines warned of supply chain disruptions and uncertain markets, but beneath the surface was fear. Fear that Africa had learned to use its resources as leverage. Fear that what happened with OPEC in the 1970s, when Arab oil producers turned energy into political power, was happening again, this time with African nations at the helm. The reactions were telling. European governments called for dialogue. American analysts spoke of risk management. But African voices told a different story. This was not risk, this was justice. It was a delayed correction to centuries of imbalance. And the people on the ground felt it. In Niamey, the capital of Niger, crowds gathered in the streets not in protest, but in celebration. They waved flags, sang songs, and shouted slogans about dignity and independence. For them, this wasn't just about uranium. It was about finally standing up to a system that treated their homeland as expendable. Meanwhile, in Paris, the tone was different. Energy executives warned of higher bills. Politicians called emergency meetings. Commentators fretted over strategic vulnerabilities. A quiet panic spread because the one thing Europe never accounted for was Africa saying no. That is the high point of this story. It is the moment when Africa shifted from background supplier to power broker, when the tables turned and the West realized its dependence. The climax is not only in Niger's uranium, it is in the collective message sent from Accra to Kampala, from Libreville to Niamey. Africa will no longer give away its wealth. And the world is watching. Some see danger. Others see opportunity, but no one can deny that Africa has seized the stage. The silent engine of the world has roared to life, and its voice cannot be ignored. When you look past the headlines and into the villages, farms, and city streets of Africa, you begin to see the deeper story. This new wave of resource sovereignty is not just about governments and policies. It is reshaping daily life, creating hope, and stirring debate across the continent. Take Guinea. For years, this small West African nation exported rice, maize, and yams while its own citizens paid inflated prices at home. Mothers struggled in markets where imported staples cost more than a family could afford. Then came the ban on exporting key crops. Suddenly, Guinean harvests stayed in Guinean kitchens. Prices stabilized. Families began to breathe a little easier. To outsiders, it looked like protectionism. To those on the ground, it was food sovereignty, a government finally saying our children eat before foreign markets profit. In Namibia, the story revolves around lithium, the lifeblood of electric cars. Instead of letting the raw ore vanish overseas, the government paused exports and demanded local processing. The effect was immediate. International companies began scouting sites for refineries in Walvis Bay and Windhoek. Thousands of jobs are on the horizon. Jobs not in mines alone, but in factories, laboratories, and logistics. For young Namibians, this policy represents something rare, a chance to work in industries tied to the global future without leaving home. It is no longer just about extracting minerals. It is about building an economy fit for the next century. Then there's Ivory Coast, where the decision to restrict raw cocoa exports is shaking one of the sweetest yet most unequal markets on Earth. For decades, Western chocolate corporations grew rich, while Ivorian farmers remained poor. Now, the government is investing in local processing chocolate factories and packaging plants. For the first time, farmers see the possibility of their children working not only in the fields, but also in modern facilities with better wages and greater dignity. Cocoa is no longer just a bean, it is becoming a pathway to industrial pride. In Zimbabwe, the chrome ban is having similar ripple effects. Smelters and metal processing plants are springing up, creating employment and raising the country's profile in regional manufacturing. The shift is not easy. Power shortages, corruption, and infrastructure gaps remain obstacles, but the political message is clear. Zimbabwe will not remain a warehouse for cheap raw ore. It will transform that ore into stainless steel alloys and advanced products, reclaiming value once lost overseas. And in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the decision to limit raw copper and cobalt exports is stirring a political awakening. For decades, cobalt miners lived and worked in brutal conditions, supplying the world's smartphones and electric cars while seeing little improvement in their own lives. With new rules requiring local processing, there is hope not only for higher wages, but for the dignity of knowing that Congo is no longer simply the world's pit stop for raw minerals. The move has sparked debates in Kinshasa's parliament, protests from some mining companies, and cautious optimism from ordinary Congolese who dream of a better deal for their children. These policies also carry political consequences beyond economics. Governments are winning legitimacy by showing they can stand up to foreign powers and protect their people's interests. Citizens long used to disappointment are responding with cautious pride. At the same time, elites who once profited from lopsided contracts are resisting, creating new internal tensions. The battle lines are drawn not just between Africa and the West, but also within each nation, between those who want quick profits and those who demand long-term sovereignty. The larger outcome is unmistakable. Africa is redefining independence. It is no longer measured only by flags or anthems, but by the ability of a nation to feed its own people, employ its youth, and capture the full value of its resources. The shift is messy, uneven, and contested, but it is real. For the first time in decades, millions of ordinary Africans feel that policies made in presidential palaces and parliaments are echoing in their own homes and wallets. That is the true revolution dignity that is no longer abstract but lived. To understand the scale of this shift, we have to step outside Africa and look at the ripple effects spreading across the globe. In Washington, Brussels, Tokyo, and Beijing, policymakers are waking up to a new reality. The very foundation of their industries, from clean energy to consumer electronics, now depends on decisions being made in African capitals. For the United States, the timing could not be more sensitive. Washington is pouring billions into the green energy transition, electric vehicles, solar panels, and battery storage. But these technologies require cobalt, copper, lithium, and rare minerals. For decades, the U.S. strategy was simple: secure supply chains abroad and let multinational corporations handle the rest. That approach no longer works. When the Democratic Republic of the Congo restricts cobalt exports, or when Namibia tells automakers they must invest in local processing, American companies like Tesla and Apple feel the squeeze. Suddenly, Made in America depends on negotiations in Kinshasa and Windhoek. This has led to quiet but urgent conversations in the U.S. State Department. Should America compete with China, which has already invested heavily in African mining and processing? Or should it attempt a new kind of partnership, one that treats African nations not as suppliers, but as equals? The dilemma is clear. Without Africa, the American clean energy dream may stall. In Europe, the shock is even sharper. France's reliance on Niger's uranium has already been exposed, and the cocoa and coffee bans from Ivory Coast and Uganda are shaking consumer industries that Europeans often take for granted. A bar of chocolate, once cheap and plentiful, now carries a price tag that reflects Africa's demand for fairness. For European politicians, this is more than a trade issue. It is a test of whether Europe can adapt to a world where it no longer sets the terms. Meanwhile, in Asia, reactions are mixed. China sees opportunity, having already built strong ties with African governments through infrastructure loans and mining deals. But even Beijing cannot escape the new reality. Local processing requirements mean China must invest inside Africa rather than simply import raw ore. India, on the other hand, views this as a chance to deepen South-South cooperation. Its grain deals and technology partnerships align more naturally with Africa's sovereignty agenda, giving New Delhi a unique role as a bridge between continents. At the global level, economists are beginning to whisper comparisons to the OPEC oil embargo of 1973. Just as Arab nations once leveraged oil to demand respect, African nations are now using minerals, crops, and timber to renegotiate their place in the world economy. Supply chains that were once invisible are now political flashpoints. Prices of gold, lithium, and uranium climb, not just because of scarcity, but because Africa is saying these resources are ours first. For ordinary people outside Africa, the effects will be felt in subtle but real ways: higher prices for coffee, chocolate, and smartphones, delays in electric car production, rising energy bills in Europe. For governments, the challenge is more profound. They must rethink decades of assumptions about Africa's role. The continent is no longer a silent warehouse. It is a negotiating table where the West must now sit as a guest, not as a master. And here lies the irony. For years, Western leaders preached about democracy, fairness, and global cooperation. Now, Africa is demanding those very principles in practice: fair pay, shared value, and mutual respect. The world is discovering that sovereignty is contagious, and Africa has lit the match. What we are witnessing is more than a shift in trade. It is the beginning of a new chapter in global power. For the first time in generations, African nations are refusing to be silent suppliers. They are keeping their gold, their coffee, their uranium, their cocoa, not as tokens of charity to the world, but as instruments of sovereignty. This is a moment of pride, but also a moment of caution. History tells us that when the powerful feel their grip slipping, they rarely let go quietly. In the 1970s, the Arab oil embargo rattled the West and reshaped geopolitics. Today, Africa's stand on raw materials may trigger similar tremors. Will powerful nations attempt to undermine these policies? Will pressure, sanctions, or backroom deals reappear to preserve the old order? These are questions that every observer of Africa must keep in mind. But there is also hope. For millions of ordinary Africans, this is the first time they see their leaders putting food jobs and dignity before foreign profits. And for those of us watching from afar, especially here in America, this is a reminder that independence is not given, it is claimed. So let me leave you with this question. Do you think President Ibrahim Traoré's vision of economic sovereignty is enough to hold against the weight of global powers? Or will Africa need even stronger alliances to protect this new era? Please share this video if you believe you are among the first to witness and support Africa's rise. And subscribe if you believe that truth is more important than headlines, because this story is not ending here. It is only beginning.